Now back down to Kings. 1 Kings 15, starting in verse 9. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel. So Abijah reigned for 3 years. Let's go back and look at this again. Chapter 15, verse 1. The 18th year of Jeroboam, Abijah became king of Judah. He reigned 3 years. The 20th year of Jeroboam, Asa becomes king of Judah. So Abijah didn't reign a full 3 years. He reigned parts of 3 years. Because Jeroboam goes from year 18 to 20 in the 3 years that Asa is on the throne. Something else you have to remember, and this is, when I post these videos, this is a complicated subject. When I post these videos, I have a written description that I include with the video link. And I will put like the timeline of the chart of the years of the kings there. We're basically around the year 900 BC right now. In addition to the idea of a king reigning for parts of a year, equaling, in their ancient way of reckoning, a full year, there are different ways of counting the beginning of a king's reign. Okay? And I'm not going to parse through exactly all of this in every instance as we go through going forward. But in general, there are 2 ways of counting the beginning of a king's reign. And different cultures did it one of these ways. You have some cultures that would mark the beginning of a king's reign literally on the day that he became king. This would basically be like our presidential inauguration. And from that moment onward, that is the beginning of his first year of reign. When Joe Biden got inaugurated as president on January 20th, 2021, that was his first day as president. So that day forward was his first year as president. Same thing going back all throughout our history as far as our presidents go. Or any elected official that has a term limit, senator, governor, representative, whatever. In the ancient way of thinking, and some cultures did that. The moment you became king, you're beginning your first year of reign. Some cultures are not that way. Some cultures did it more like we do our birthdays. When you're born, when a child is born, he does not become 1 year old on that day. He becomes 1 year old a year from that day. So I was born on July 8th, 1981. So my first birthday, I turned 1 year old on July 8th, 1982. I was not 1 year old on July 8th, 1981. For that to be the case, I would have had to have been born on July 8th, 1980. Okay, so for some kingdoms, for some cultures, the king's first year is not actually considered his first year. It's like a year 0. It's like his, you just call it year 0. And they start counting his reign with the next year, the year after he becomes 1 year old as king. And so that factors into it too. And we have 2 kingdoms here, Kingdom of Israel and Kingdom of Judah, and they used separate systems. And the books of Kings and Chronicles don't mention that, okay? The writers of Kings and Chronicles are assuming that their audience, especially Kings, which is older, are assuming that their audience knows the difference between these kinds of years, and it doesn't need to be told about it, okay? The fact of the matter, unfortunately, though, is that it wasn't very long after these books were written that the knowledge of this information was lost, even by the people, even by the Hebrews. When the Hebrews set about writing, translating their Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the common language of the day, in the 200s BC, they had already, this was only about a couple hundred years after Chronicles would have been written, for example. Chronicles were probably written in the mid to late 400s BC, and only about a couple hundred years later, when the Hebrews tried to set out translating their Hebrew scriptures into Greek for the people of their day, they'd already forgotten some of this information about how to parse through this data of the kings. And they didn't, and so when you add up these numbers by themselves, they don't make any sense. They don't fit together. Because the writers of these books, Kings and Chronicles, are relying on their readers knowing some information that they, the writers, know, and they don't explicitly tell us because they assume that we know. And one of those is the difference between the accession year, the non-accession year systems, and which of these kingdoms was using which system at which time. Okay, there's no indication in these books of which system of counting years Judah and Israel are using, and when they switch, or if they switch, or when they, it's like that. There's just none. Okay, the writers are assuming that we know that because their original audience would have known that. But again, like I said, it didn't take very long before we didn't know that any longer. Even their own people didn't know that any longer. Their own priests, a couple hundred years later, didn't know that any longer. So from the 200s BC to the 1900s AD, 2200 years, we didn't know how to count these numbers. It took a dedicated scholarly effort throughout the 20th century to finally unlock the mystery and fit together the timeline of the Hebrew kings for the first time in over 2,000 years. So that was difficult, okay. So that's one of the complications, is counting the beginning of the king's reign, and how each kingdom did it a little bit differently, and maybe they switched it back and forth at different times, and the text doesn't tell us that. The other thing to consider is that we have the idea of co-regencies, and that happens when a father and a son are reigning simultaneously for a period of time. We saw that in the days of David and Solomon. At some point late in his reign, David made Solomon his co-regent. We read about that at the end of Chronicles. Apparently, it wasn't a very dominant co-regency, because when the time came for David to actually die, Adonijah, another son of his, tried to take the throne, or tried to make himself, be put first in line, and so they had to do it again. They had to, coronate Solomon again, kind of. But we had an example of that happening there. We don't know how long it lasted, but we have an example of that happening there. We're going to have an example here of this idea of there being 10 years of peace, and then Abijah reigning. There is some element of co-regency here with Abijah and Asa and some of the confusing timelines here. And the text doesn't really ever say this. I mean, it's rare. We'll see we'll see if it gets mentioned at any specific point in the future. But a lot of times these kings will become kings while their fathers are still alive. And that gets counted as a co-regency, so that gets added into the numbers, okay? So it's like you could have a king, let's say Rehoboam. I'm not sure if he had a co-regency, but let's say he did. We do have this idea of, let's see, I think it's in Chronicles, about the years. Anyway, let's just use this as a figure, as an example. Rehoboam reigns for 17 years. If he makes his son Abijah king in his 16th year as co-regent, well, then that adds up. It's like now it's not just strictly 17 years and plus 3, and now maybe 16. So you do that enough, you add those numbers up enough, you get those numbers fudged in there enough, and it messes up your timeline. Okay, you can't just add these numbers mathematically on top of each other, because some of them overlap. And so all these things make it difficult to parse through this data. Now, we have done it. Okay, in the 20th century, like I said, there was a determined effort, primarily by a man named Edwin Thiele, who worked on this for 50 years in the 20th century, and basically came up with the chronology of the Hebrew kings that I think, from what I can tell, was widely accepted these days. So we have the information, we have kind of cracked the code, so to speak, but this is a problem, and it's been a problem since the 200s BC. It's not a new thing. So I just wanted to point that out. I should probably make a new video. You don't have to spend a lot. Again, I'm going to, in these video descriptions, I'm going to have the timeline of the kings written down. So you don't have to really worry about it too much. But you do need to be aware of some of these issues, because there are legitimate issues that need to be dealt with.